The Black Death was one of the most devastating natural selection processes in history. It wiped out 30 to 50% of the population of Europe and North Africa. There were even some survivors who developed immunity to the plague after being reinfected by it multiple times. But there's more to surviving the plague than just luck. So how did people survive the Black Death? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at 3 different ways that helped people survive the plague, from the smartest way to the dumbest way. First up is practicing good hygiene. This might seem pretty obvious because we all know that good hygiene is important for staying healthy. But back in the 14th century, when the Black Death was ravaging Europe, people didn't really understand how germs worked. They did, however, understand that washing your hands could prevent illness. During the Middle Ages, it was common practice to wash your hands before eating and after using the bathroom, and this would have helped to prevent the spread of the disease. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which is still around today. It's most commonly found in rodents like rats, and it can be passed to humans through the bite of an infected flea. Once it's in you, the bacteria starts multiplying, and that's when things start getting bad. It causes fever, weakness, pain, and swelling of the lymph nodes, and if that doesn't kill you, the bleeding and the organ failure will. Even if you do survive, the damage to your lungs can leave you with pneumonia and a lifetime of respiratory problems. And while it's pretty gross to think about now, during the time of the Black Death, people were exposed to a lot more bacteria on a daily basis than we are today. Not only were the streets dirtier, but people shared beds and didn't change their clothes often. Rats were everywhere, and they carried fleas that were infected with the plague. Also, people didn't know anything about germs or viruses, so they didn't take any precautions to avoid getting sick. As far as they knew, the only way to get sick was by being exposed to someone who was sick. That's why it was so important to practice good hygiene. If you washed your hands before eating and after using the bathroom, you were less likely to get exposed to bacteria. And if you avoided sharing beds with sick people and changed your clothes often, you were even less likely to get sick. In fact, during the outbreak of the plague in London, there was a group of people who practiced these behaviors, and they were able to reduce their risk of infection by 90%. But not everyone was willing to take these precautions. Some people believed that the plague was God's punishment for their sins, so they didn't try to avoid getting sick. Others thought that the best way to protect yourself was to wear protective clothing, like long sleeves and gloves. But this didn't always work, since the plague could also be spread through the air. People who worked in close contact with others, like doctors and nurses, were especially vulnerable to infection. But even if you did everything right, you were still at risk of contracting the disease. While we don't know exactly what killed everyone who died during the Black Death pandemic, we do know that those who survived probably had a genetic advantage. A study published in the journal Nature Genetics in 2022 found that people who survived the plague were more likely to have certain genes that help them fight off the bacteria. One of these genes helps the immune system identify and kill bacteria. Another gene helps regulate inflammation in the body, which can help prevent the kind of organ damage that can be caused by the Black Death. And a third gene helps control cell death, which is important for preventing the kind of bleeding that can occur with the plague. While it's not clear how many people had these genes, the researchers estimate that it was anywhere from 40 to 70% of the population. So it seems like having the right genes could have been one way that people were able to survive the Black Death. But it wasn't the only factor. While genetics definitely played a role in who survived the plague and who didn't, it wasn't the only thing that mattered. The second way to survive the plague was by avoiding close contact with others. As we mentioned earlier, the Black Death was spread through the air as well as through the bite of infected fleas. So the best way to avoid getting sick was to stay away from other people as much as possible. Of course, this wasn't always easy. People had to work and take care of their families, even if that meant coming into close contact with others. But there were some jobs that were considered safer than others. For example, farmers were able to keep working on their farms without coming into close contact with other people. They were also able to eat the food that they grew, which may have helped them stay healthier. In general, people who lived in rural areas were more likely to survive the plague than people who lived in cities. That's because cities were more densely populated, and there was more exposure to rats and fleas carrying the disease. Rural communities were also more likely to be self-sufficient, which meant they were less dependent on trade and commerce. When trade routes were disrupted due to the plague, rural communities were able to continue producing their own food and supplies, while cities were more likely to run out of food and supplies. As a result, people in rural areas were more likely to survive the plague than people in cities. Even if you took all the right precautions, sometimes being in the right place at the right time was the difference between life and death. But what if you couldn't escape the plague? What if it came to your town and you couldn't leave? Well, the third way to survive the plague was to actually catch it and recover. Yep, you heard that right. Some people were able to catch the plague, recover, and then go on to survive the pandemic. Of course, this wasn't easy. The symptoms of the plague were absolutely horrible. As we mentioned earlier, the plague can cause fever, weakness, pain, and swelling of the lymph nodes. And if that doesn't kill you, the bleeding and the organ failure will. But some people were able to make it through. And once they recovered, they were immune to the disease. As awful as the symptoms are, the body has a remarkable ability to heal itself. And once the immune system identifies and kills the pathogen, the body can start to repair the damage that's been done. In the case of the plague, this means repairing the damage to the organs and blood vessels. Some people were able to make a full recovery, but others were left with permanent disabilities. But even if they didn't make a full recovery, they were immune to the plague. Researchers believe that the immunity that comes from recovering from the plague is similar to the immunity that comes from getting a vaccine. When someone is vaccinated, they're given a small dose of a pathogen so their body can identify and kill it before it does any damage. Once the body has identified the pathogen, it remembers how to fight it off. So if the person is exposed to the disease in the future, the immune system is ready to act quickly. Researchers think that the same thing happened to people who recovered from the plague. Their bodies identified the bacteria and learned how to fight it off. So if they were exposed to the plague again, their bodies were able to fight it off quickly before it could do any real damage. Of course, this isn't foolproof. Some people who recovered from the plague went on to get it again and die, but it does explain how some people were able to survive the plague multiple times. It's also how we're able to develop vaccines today. Vaccines work by exposing our bodies to a small dose of a pathogen, so we can identify and kill it before it does any damage. And while we don't have a vaccine for the plague yet, we do have vaccines for other diseases like smallpox, polio, and measles. Vaccines are one of the greatest public health interventions ever developed. They've saved millions of lives and prevented countless cases of disease and disability, and it's all thanks to our understanding of the immune system and how it works. So there you have it, 3 ways that people survived the Black Death, from the smartest way to the dumbest way. But no matter how they did it, one thing's for sure, they were some lucky survivors. Do you know any obscure historical facts? Share them with us in the comments.